The emergency room at St. Benedict's Hospital was chaos, and among it all moved Naomi Carter, a black nurse with a pronounced limp that made her everyone's easiest target. They assigned her the worst tasks, whispered she was too slow for trauma work, and complained about her damaged knee like it was a personal insult. But there was one thing none of them knew about the quiet, limping nurse they constantly dismissed. Naomi Carter wasn't just some burned-out civilian struggling to keep up. They had unwittingly pushed aside a legend, someone who'd kept Marines alive in impossible conditions, someone who once operated under a call sign that made hardened soldiers believe in miracles. And the day 4 military helicopters landed outside demanding Shield 6, this hospital was going to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The fluorescent lights of St. Benedict's Hospital hummed their constant tired song, casting harsh shadows across linoleum floors that had seen too many emergencies and not enough funding. In the chaos of the emergency room, where overworked staff moved like exhausted dancers through an endless performance, Naomi Carter existed in the spaces between notice and dismissal. She was 32, black, and moved with a pronounced limp that drew eyes for all the wrong reasons. Her left knee, supported by a medical brace that peeked from beneath her scrubs, carried weight that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with a past she never spoke about. The other nurses worked around her like water flowing past a stone, necessary but unremarkable, always moving faster than she could follow. St. Benedict's was drowning. Budget cuts had stripped departments bare. The ER operated at twice its intended capacity every single day. Ambulances arrived in waves that never seemed to break, and the staff absorbed the pressure until it became background noise to their exhaustion. In that environment, Naomi was the easy target for everyone's frustration. Can someone who actually moves at hospital speed take this? Sarah Mitchell, a senior white nurse with 20 years of tenure and twice that much attitude, snapped as she thrust a chart toward the charge desk. Her eyes found Naomi automatically. Oh wait, never mind. Carter, room 7 needs a cleanup. Again. The other nurses didn't meet Naomi's eyes. They never did. She took the chart without comment and limped toward room 7, where a patient had been sick across most of the floor. It was her 4th cleanup duty that shift. No one else seemed to get assigned the work that required being on your knees. In the break room, voices carried through the thin walls. Naomi heard them as she refilled her water bottle, the same conversation that happened every week with different words. She's too slow for emergency. Work, an orderly named Marcus said, his voice certain with the confidence of someone who had never actually watched her work. I don't know why they keep her on this floor. She should be in long-term care or something, somewhere the pace doesn't matter. I heard she failed out of a surgical program, another voice added. Naomi didn't recognize this one, probably one of the new interns. That's why she's just doing basic floor nursing, couldn't handle the pressure. The water bottle filled. Naomi's hand didn't shake. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. Words were just sounds, and sounds couldn't hurt you if you didn't give them power. She capped the bottle, turned, and walked back into the corridor where a patient monitor was screaming. The code blue alarm shattered the normal chaos into something sharper. Room 12. Cardiac arrest. Naomi moved toward it on instinct, her limp somehow less pronounced when urgency overrode pain. She arrived as the crash cart did, as nurses flooded in, as Dr. Philip Hendricks, a resident who'd been on shift for 16 hours, stood frozen at the bedside. The patient, a man in his 50s with gray skin and no pulse, wasn't breathing. The monitor showed a flat line that meant seconds mattered more than protocol. Someone start compressions, Dr. Hendricks said, but his hands hovered uselessly above the patient's chest. His eyes were wide. This was his first solo code. Everyone in the room could see him drowning. Naomi stepped forward. Her hands found the patient's chest with practiced precision, fingers interlaced, shoulders positioned directly over the sternum. She began compressions with a rhythm that came from muscle memory, older than anyone in that room understood. "Airway," she said quietly, her voice cutting through panic without rising in volume. A nurse moved to bag the patient. "Check the rhythm." Another nurse operated the defibrillator. Naomi called the pace, managed the flow, kept the choreography of emergency medicine moving while Dr. Hendricks watched like a spectator at his own failure. 2 minutes. 3. The line jumped. The heart caught. The patient gasped. Color returned to gray skin like sunrise after a long night. Dr. Hendricks blinked as if waking from a trance. He looked at Naomi, at the patient, at the monitor showing stable vitals. Then he turned to the attending physician who'd just arrived. "Got him back," Dr. Hendricks said, his voice steady now, professional. "Rhythm restored. He's stable." The attending nodded, made notes, congratulated the team. No one mentioned that Dr. Hendricks had frozen. No one mentioned that Naomi had run the entire code. The attending left. The nurses dispersed. Dr. Hendricks wouldn't meet Naomi's eyes as he walked past her. She limped back to the nurses' station alone. In the locker room at the end of her shift, Naomi sat on the wooden bench that had held 10,000 tired bodies before hers. Her fingers worked the Velcro straps of her knee brace with practiced efficiency, loosening the compression that had held her together for 12 hours. When the brace came off, the scars underneath told a story written in violence. The skin was twisted, discolored, marked with the signature of shrapnel and surgical intervention that had happened too late to prevent permanent damage. This wasn't an old sports injury. This wasn't a car accident. This was the kind of damage that came from fire and metal and choices made in seconds that echoed through years. Naomi's jaw tightened as she massaged the ruined joint. Pain was constant now, a companion she'd learned to ignore the way you ignore a ringing in your ears. She could function through it. She could work through it. She could live through it. That was enough. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her scrubs, a thin silver chain held something she never removed. One of the newer nurses, a young woman named Bethany with bright eyes and rules memorized from textbooks, had noticed it during a shift change. "You know we're not supposed to wear jewelry, right?" Bethany had said, her tone helpful, not cruel. "Hospital policy. Infection control." Naomi had stopped moving. For just a moment, something cold passed through her expression. "It doesn't come off. But policy says it doesn't come off." Naomi's voice stayed quiet, but the finality in it ended the conversation. Bethany had backed away, confused, and never asked again. The night shift brought a different kind of chaos. A homeless veteran arrived in 4-point restraints, thrashing against the paramedics, his eyes wild with something beyond the present moment. "Combat trauma," the report said. "Infected wounds on both arms. Severe malnutrition, hallucinations." They brought him to room 3. Naomi took the assignment because no one else wanted to deal with someone who might swing at them. She'd dealt with worse. She approached his bedside slowly, hands visible, voice calm. "Sir, I'm Naomi. I'm a nurse. I need to look at your arms. No one's going to hurt you here." The veteran's eyes found her face. For a moment, something cleared in his gaze. He looked at her. Really looked. Then his eyes dropped to her leg, to the way she stood with her weight shifted, to the brace visible beneath her scrubs. His thrashing stopped. His breathing slowed. He stared at her like he was seeing something no one else could see. "You're one of them," he whispered, his voice hoarse and certain. "You're one of them." Naomi's hands didn't shake as she prepared the sedative. She injected it smoothly, professionally, her face carefully neutral. But after the veteran's eyes closed and his breathing evened into medicated sleep, she stood by his bedside longer than necessary. Her hands were shaking then. The hospital director's office smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long and ambition that had curdled into bureaucracy. Daniel Morrison sat behind a desk covered in budget reports and patient satisfaction surveys. His expression arranged into something he probably thought looked compassionate. "Naomi, I'll be direct with you." He folded his hands on the desk. "We've received multiple complaints about your performance. Staff members say you slow teams down. They say you're not aggressive enough for emergency medicine. They say you don't fit trauma culture." Naomi sat across from him, her face quiet, her hands still. "I'm not saying you're a bad nurse," Morrison continued. "But maybe emergency work isn't your strength. Have you considered requesting a transfer? Long-term care, perhaps? Rehabilitation? Somewhere the pace is more manageable for your condition." Her condition. He meant her leg. He meant the limp that marked her as damaged, as less than, as unable. She'd heard it before. She'd hear it again. "Is that an order, sir?" she asked. "It's a strong suggestion." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Think about it." Naomi nodded. She left his office. And 3 hours later, when the ER board lit up with 5 critical incoming traumas from a multi-vehicle collision, she stepped forward to take assignments like she always did. The teenager arrived with more blood outside his body than inside it. 17 years old. Gang shooting. Entrance wound in his abdomen, exit wound through his back, and vitals that were crashing toward zero while doctors shouted over each other about whether to take him to surgery immediately or stabilize him first. Naomi stood at the edge of the trauma bay, watching the chaos, seeing the patterns everyone else was missing. The blood loss pattern didn't match the wounds. The vitals were dropping too fast for the visible injuries. Something else was happening inside that kid's body, something they were missing while they argued about procedure. "Check for a secondary bleed," she said quietly. No one heard her. They were too loud, too focused on being right instead of being effective. "Check for a secondary bleed." Louder this time. The trauma chief, Dr. Patricia Morrison, a black woman with 30 years of surgical experience, turned to look at Naomi. "What?" "The pattern's wrong." Naomi moved closer, pointing at the monitor. "That's not just the GSW. He's bleeding internally somewhere you haven't found yet. Probably splenic involvement from the trajectory. If you don't find it in the next 2 minutes, you'll lose him on the table." The room went quiet. Dr. Morrison stared at Naomi, then at the monitors, then at the patient. She made a decision. "Get him to imaging now, full abdominal scan." She turned to Naomi. "You, stay where I can see you." They found the bleed exactly where Naomi said it would be. They saved the boy's life with 40 seconds to spare. After the surgery, Dr. Morrison found Naomi at the nurse's station. "Where did you train?" she asked. Naomi didn't look up from her charting. "Nowhere special." That wasn't nowhere special. Dr. Morrison's voice carried something between suspicion and respect. "That was field medicine, combat-level pattern recognition. So I'll ask again. Where did you train? Does it matter?" Naomi's pen moved steadily across the page. "The kid lived." Dr. Morrison watched her for a long moment, then walked away. But she didn't stop watching after that. At home that night, Naomi's apartment was small, clean and empty in all the ways that mattered. No photographs on the walls. No personal touches. Nothing that said a life was happening here instead of just existence between shifts. She moved to her bedroom closet, reached past the uniforms and civilian clothes, and pulled out a small metal box with a combination lock. Her fingers knew the numbers without thinking. The lock clicked open. Inside, folded carefully, was a blood-stained patch with markings that no civilian would recognize. A military medical insignia, worn and faded, and beneath it a photograph. 6 soldiers and 1 woman, all in combat gear, standing in front of a helicopter in a landscape made of dust and danger. The woman was younger, stronger, standing without a limp. Her face was harder then, carved by sand and survival. But her eyes were the same. The woman was Naomi. She stared at the photograph for a long time, her fingers tracing the faces of people she hadn't seen in years. People she'd saved. People she'd failed. People who'd called her something other than her name when the radios went dead and the extraction points burned, and death was a certainty that she somehow turned into survival. Her knee throbbed. She closed the box, put it back in the closet, took her pain medication, and tried not to dream about helicopters. The next morning, the hospital felt different. The air carried tension that had nothing to do with the usual emergencies. News played silently on the lobby television, showing footage of a military transport accident, details classified, casualties unknown. The scroll at the bottom of the screen mentioned high-profile personnel and ongoing recovery operations. Naomi watched the screen for 3 seconds too long. Something cold moved through her chest. She turned away and walked into the ER, where the day shift was already drowning. She didn't see the news anchor mention a missing medical specialist. She didn't hear them say that military officials were searching for someone with specific trauma experience. She didn't know that somewhere in a secure operations center, someone was pulling personnel files that had been sealed for years. She just went to work. Limping, invisible. Necessary only in the ways no one wanted to acknowledge. And outside, somewhere beyond the city, helicopters were already being fueled for a mission no one at St. Benedict's Hospital could imagine. The hospital's larger crisis became impossible to ignore by the second week. St. Benedict's wasn't just understaffed. It was structurally failing. The ER operated beyond capacity every day. Equipment broke and stayed broken, supply orders went unfilled. Nurses worked double shifts not because they wanted overtime, but because there was no one else to cover the floor. In that environment, every delay became someone's fault, and Naomi Carter became the person everyone blamed. A patient waited 40 minutes for pain medication. Naomi's fault for moving too slow. A crash cart wasn't restocked properly. Naomi's fault for not checking it during her shift. A family complained about wait times. Somehow, inevitably, Naomi's fault for existing in the way of efficiency. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything else. Silently. Completely. Like it was just another kind of pain to function through. The new trauma surgeon arrived on a Tuesday morning with credentials that made the administration excited, and a background that made Naomi go very still when she heard it. Dr. Ethan Cole, former military contractor, embedded with special operations units overseas, now transitioning to civilian medicine. He was white, early 40s, with the kind of quiet observation skills that came from environments where missing details meant dying. He watched Naomi work during his first shift. Not obviously, not in a way that felt invasive, but she felt his attention like pressure against her skin. He noticed her precision, the way she scanned rooms before touching patients, the economy of her movements, the terminology she used that was just slightly wrong for civilian medicine, but exactly right for something else. During a trauma case, a patient coding from massive internal bleeding, Naomi had positioned the crash cart at an angle that seemed arbitrary, until Dr. Cole realized it gave optimal access for both chest compressions and emergency intubation, while leaving the primary exit clear. That wasn't something you learned in nursing school. That was something you learned when rooms became combat zones, and every second was about survival geometry. After the case, he found her in the supply room, restocking the cart she'd just used. "Your knee," he said without preamble. "That's not from running." Naomi's hands paused for half a heartbeat, then continued moving. Injury from a few years ago. It's fine. It's not fine. You're compensating every time you stand. You shift weight unconsciously. You position yourself near walls and railings. His voice wasn't unkind, just factual. That's not recreational damage. That's traumatic joint destruction. Naomi turned to face him, her expression completely flat. Drop it. I'm just saying, if you need accommodations, drop it. The cold in her voice could have frozen blood. I don't need accommodations. I need people to let me work. Dr. Cole held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. He left the supply room. But Naomi saw him watching her more carefully after that, and she didn't know if that made things better or worse. The National Guard recruit came in on a Wednesday night, airlifted from a training accident at a base 2 hours north. Crush, injuries, possible spinal involvement, unconscious but stable. They settled him into a monitored bed, started fluids, ordered scans. Standard protocol for major trauma. Then he started screaming. Not pain screaming, coordinate screaming. Numbers and letters in sequences that meant nothing to the civilian staff, but meant everything to anyone who'd ever operated in hostile territory. Grid coordinates, rally points, casualty reports shouted into darkness, his mind trapped in some training scenario that felt more real than the hospital around him. The nurses tried to calm him. He fought them. Dr. Cole moved to sedate him, but before he could, Naomi's voice cut through the chaos. Sierra 4, stand down. Rally Point Baker is secure. All personnel accounted for. Medivac inbound. Her voice carried absolute authority, using terminology that shouldn't exist in a civilian nurse's vocabulary. The recruit's screaming stopped. His eyes opened, confused but responsive. His breathing slowed. Medivac inbound, he whispered. You're secure, Naomi said quietly, her hand on his shoulder. You're safe. Sleep now. He did. The room was completely silent. Every staff member was staring at Naomi. Dr. Cole's expression had shifted from curiosity to certainty. 2 medics who'd brought the recruit in had gone very still. Naomi didn't explain. She just walked out of the room, her limp somehow more pronounced, like adrenaline had been holding it back and now the dam was breaking. Dr. Cole followed her into the hallway. Those were military medical codes. He was hallucinating. I calmed him down. That's nursing. Naomi didn't slow down. No, that was something else entirely. Dr. Cole moved in front of her, blocking her path gently but firmly. I've worked with combat medics. I know what they sound like. I know how they move. And you're not just a nurse. Naomi's breath came harder. Her hands were shaking. I need to get back to work. Who are you? His voice was softer now, less confrontational. Really? Someone who wants to be left alone. Naomi moved around him and disappeared into the medroom, the door closing with finality. But the seed was planted. Dr. Cole started noticing more. The way Naomi assessed trauma patients used battlefield triage principles. The way she anticipated complications, followed combat injury progression patterns. The way she never, ever stood with her back to open doorways. He didn't know what she'd been, but he knew she'd been something. The night shift stretched into its 8th hour when the fragments started coming. A motorcycle accident arrived. The rider's helmet had saved his brain, but his chest told a different story. Pneumothorax. Possible hemothorax. Airways compromised. Naomi assisted with the chest tube insertion, her hands steady, her instructions precise. But while her hands worked, her mind was somewhere else. The smell of blood and antiseptic became the smell of dust and burning fuel. The patients labored. Breathing became someone else's breathing, someone younger, someone who'd screamed her name while she'd worked with hands covered in sand and blood. The overhead lights flickered. For just a second, they became the strobing emergency lighting of a helicopter taking fire. The sound of the ventilator became rotor wash. The cold of the OR became the cold of high altitude with the doors blown open. Naomi! Dr. Cole's voice pulled her back. You with me? She blinked. The OR resolved into focus. The patient was stable. The tube was placed. Everything was fine. Her hands weren't shaking. Yet. I'm here, she said. But she wasn't. Not completely. Part of her was still in the desert, still in the firefight, still trying to save people who'd already died. The wealthy patient's family arrived on Thursday with lawyers, attitude, and the kind of entitlement that mistook money for medical expertise. Their mother had fallen, broken her hip, and required surgery. Routine procedure, good prognosis. But the family had opinions about everything, including who should be allowed near their mother. I don't want that nurse, the daughter said, pointing at Naomi. She's too slow. She limps. How can we trust someone who can't even walk properly to take care of our mother? The charge nurse, already exhausted from a 16-hour shift, didn't have the energy to fight. Naomi, you're reassigned. Take intake. Naomi looked at the patient, an elderly woman who reminded her of someone she'd once carried through smoke. Then she looked at the daughter, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Then she nodded and walked away. Daniel Morrison, the hospital director, called her to his office the next morning. The formal write-up sat on his desk between them. This is becoming a pattern, he said. Multiple complaints, performance concerns, and now a family-threatening legal action if you're involved in their mother's care. He slid the paper toward her. I'm suspending you from trauma rotations pending review. You're assigned to intake and administrative duties until further notice. How long? Naomi asked. Until the review is complete. Could be weeks. Could be longer. He didn't sound happy about it, but he didn't sound regretful either. I'm sorry, Naomi, but my hands are tied. She signed the paper. She left his office, and she spent the rest of her shift at a desk, doing paperwork, watching the ER board light up with critical cases she wasn't allowed to touch. The crash happened during hour 9 of her intake shift. A construction accident, massive hemorrhage, patient critical. The trauma team rushed him into the bay directly in Naomi's line of sight. She could see everything through the glass. The blood, the panic, the failing vitals. The doctors trying everything and watching it not be enough. She knew what to do. She could see the solution from where she sat. The bleed pattern suggested a specific arterial injury that required a specific approach, and they were missing it. They were losing him, and she wasn't allowed to help. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk. Her breathing came shallow. She watched the monitor flatline once, twice. Watched them shock him. Watched him slip further away. She couldn't stay in that chair. She stood, moved toward the stairwell, her legs screaming with every step. She made it to the landing between floors before her knee gave out completely. She slid down the wall, her back against cold concrete, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself cry. Silent tears that came from a place deeper than grief, older than guilt. She cried for the man dying in the ER. She cried for the soldiers she'd saved and the ones she hadn't. She cried for the person she'd been and the person she'd become. And she cried because her knee hurt so badly she couldn't stand, and standing was the only thing she'd ever known how to do. The homeless veteran woke on Saturday morning, lucid for the first time since his admission. The infection had cleared. The medications had stabilized his mind. He asked the day nurse to find Naomi specifically. When she arrived, he was sitting up in bed, his eyes clear and focused. I remember you, he said. That's good. Memory's important. Naomi checked his vitals, professional and distant. No, I remember you. He reached for her hand. His grip was weak but insistent. From before. Overseas. You were one of them. The ones they sent when everything went wrong. Naomi's breath stopped. You're confused. I'm not. His eyes held hers. They called you angels because you never let us die. You came in when the radios were dead and the extraction was impossible and command had written us off. You came anyway. She should have left. She should have called this a hallucination, a trauma response, a mistake. Instead, she pulled the curtain closed around his bed. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "James Patterson, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Battalion." His voice was steady. "You pulled me out of a burning Humvee outside Kandahar. My leg was pinned. You stayed with me for 4 hours until they could cut me free. You told me stories about home the whole time so I wouldn't pass out, so I wouldn't die." Naomi's hands were shaking. "That wasn't me." "Yes, it was." James's eyes filled. "Is Shield 6 still alive?" The name hit her like a physical blow. She stepped back, her knee nearly buckling. "Don't call me that." "Why not?" "That's who you are. That's who you were when you saved my life." He leaned forward. "They told us Shield 6 could bring people back from the edge of death itself. I watched you drag 5 men through fire in one night. I watched you operate on a kid while mortars were landing 50 feet away. You didn't shake. You didn't quit. You just kept working. That person doesn't exist anymore." Naomi's voice was barely a whisper. "Then why are you still saving people?" James asked. She didn't have an answer. She left the room before he could see her, completely break down. That night, while Naomi sat at the intake desk charting vitals and pretending her entire world wasn't collapsing, a phone rang somewhere deep in the hospital administration wing. A secure line that rarely received calls. The junior receptionist, working late because someone had to, picked it up out of habit. The voice on the other end was military, professional, and urgent. "This is Joint Special Operations Command. We're trying to locate a former combat medic, last known to be working in civilian medicine in this region. Call sign Shield 6, real name classified. If anyone matching that profile is currently employed at your facility, this is a matter of national security." The receptionist, 23 years old and 3 months into her first real job, stammered something about needing to transfer the call. She put it on hold. She stared at her computer screen. She had no idea who to transfer it to. She wrote down the message, put it in the director's inbox, and went back to her spreadsheets. The message wouldn't be found until Monday morning. By then, it would be too late to matter, because by then, the helicopters would already be landing. Naomi went home that night with her knee wrapped in ice and her mind wrapped in memories she couldn't escape. She took her medication. She sat in the dark. And she didn't hear the phone ring in an office 50 miles away, where someone was authorizing helicopter deployment to search for a legend most people thought was dead. She just sat in the dark, wondering how much longer she could keep pretending the past was really past. Wondering how much longer she could keep standing. Wondering why she even tried. The unidentified patient arrived on Monday morning under circumstances that turned St. Benedict's Hospital into something closer to a military checkpoint than a place of healing. 4 armed escorts in tactical gear flanked the gurney. No names were given. No medical history was provided. The patient himself was unconscious, intubated, covered in wounds that told stories the escorts refused to explain. Severe trauma, multiple shrapnel wounds, internal bleeding, vitals unstable and dropping. The kind of injuries that came from explosions in combat, not civilian accidents. Hospital administration demanded answers. The escorts gave nothing but cold stares and orders to save the patient's life. Naomi watched from her intake desk as the chaos unfolded. She wasn't supposed to be involved. She was still suspended, still confined to paperwork and administrative duties, while real medicine happened in rooms she couldn't enter. But her eyes tracked the gurney as it passed, and something in her chest went tight and cold. She knew those wound patterns. She'd treated them before, in places where hospitals were tents and operating rooms were dirt floors under canvas. The shrapnel distribution suggested a specific type of explosive device. The burn patterns around the entry points indicated proximity to the blast source. The secondary wounds on the patient's arms and chest told her he'd been shielding someone else when the explosion happened. This wasn't random trauma. This was a soldier who'd thrown himself between death and someone he was trying to protect. Dr. Cole took lead on the case, his military contractor background making him the logical choice for treating someone with classified injuries. He worked quickly, efficiently, calling out orders that the trauma team followed without question. But 15 minutes into stabilization, complications began that the civilian staff didn't recognize. Naomi saw them. From her desk, through the glass wall separating her from the trauma bay, she watched the monitors. She saw the pressure readings that indicated something beyond the obvious injuries. She saw the vitals suggesting internal damage that imaging hadn't revealed yet. She saw Dr. Cole and his team treating the symptoms while missing the underlying cause. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk. She shouldn't intervene. She wasn't allowed to intervene. She'd been suspended specifically to keep her away from cases like this. But watching someone die from a treatable injury because no one recognized the pattern felt like dying herself. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the trauma chief who'd witnessed Naomi's diagnostic skills with the gunshot victim, appeared beside her desk. "You see something." It wasn't a question. Naomi didn't pretend otherwise. Secondary cavity trauma. The shrapnel that made it through his vest created pressure zones in his chest cavity. They're treating the bleeds, but they're missing the crush injury underneath. His lungs collapsing incrementally. If they don't address it in the next 10 minutes, he'll code. Dr. Morrison stared at her. "You can tell that from here?" "I've seen it before." Naomi's voice was quiet, factual. "Many times." "Where?" Naomi didn't answer. Dr. Morrison didn't wait for one. She turned and walked directly into the trauma bay. 30 seconds later, Dr. Cole was ordering new imaging. 2 minutes after that, they found exactly what Naomi had predicted. The lung was failing. The pressure was building. And they had minutes, not hours, to fix it. Dr. Cole's head turned toward the glass wall. His eyes found Naomi sitting at her desk, frozen, her hands white-knuckled on the armrests. He said something to Dr. Morrison. She nodded. They worked together to stabilize the immediate crisis, following the roadmap Naomi's observation had provided. The patient survived. For now, after the immediate emergency passed, Dr. Cole found Naomi still at her desk, charting vitals for patients she wasn't treating, trying to look like she hadn't just saved a man's life from 50 feet away. "You weren't trained in any civilian program." He didn't bother with pretense anymore. That wasn't nurse's intuition. That was battlefield medicine, combat-level trauma recognition, so I'm asking you directly now, and I need a real answer. What unit were you with? Naomi's pen stopped moving. She set it down carefully, precisely, like it might explode if she moved too fast. "I'm a nurse. You're a combat medic." Dr. Cole's voice was low, intense, but not angry. "I've worked with them. I've trained with them. I know what they look like, how they think, how they see injuries that civilians miss. And you're not just any combat medic. You're someone who saw enough battlefield trauma to recognize patterns most people never encounter." "Doesn't matter what I was." Naomi met his eyes finally. "I'm not that person anymore. That person just saved a man's life without even being in the room." Dr. Cole leaned against her desk. "Maybe you need to stop running from who you are." Before Naomi could respond, the trauma bay alarms screamed. The unidentified patient was crashing. His heart had stopped. The team was scrambling, but nothing they did was working. Dr. Cole ran back toward the bay. Naomi watched through the glass as the patient flatlined once, twice as they shocked him and got nothing. As Dr. Morrison called for different medications and different approaches and watched them all fail. Naomi stood. Her knee screamed in protest. She ignored it. She walked toward the trauma bay, each step deliberate, each step feeling like walking toward something she'd been running from for 3 years. She pushed through the doors. 6 people turned to stare at her. No one told her to leave. "Rotate your compression angle 15 degrees lateral," she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "You're missing the optimal pressure point because of the shrapnel displacement. And switch to combat dose epinephrine. His system's been through too much stress for standard civilian dosing." Dr. Morrison looked at Dr. Cole. Dr. Cole looked at Naomi. Then he nodded. They followed her instructions. The compressions changed. The medication doses increased. 30 seconds passed. 45. The monitor jumped. The heart caught. The patient gasped, his chest heaving as life returned. The room exhaled collectively. Naomi stepped back, her legs shaking, her hands steady. She'd broken every protocol, violated her suspension. And she didn't care. The man was alive. That was all that mattered. Dr. Morrison turned to face her fully. "You're going to tell me who you are, right now. Because what you just did isn't possible unless you've done it hundreds of times before." Naomi opened her mouth to answer. Then her chain slipped out from under her scrubs, pulled loose by the physical exertion of moving too fast on a damaged knee. It hung visible against her uniform, and on it was something that made one of the armed escorts go completely still. A blood-darkened medical patch. Small. Worn. The kind given to combat medics who'd achieved something beyond normal service. The symbol on it wasn't standard military insignia. It was something more specific, something that only existed in certain classified units that operated in places no one talked about. The escort stared at it, his face drained of color. His hand moved to his radio without conscious thought. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. "Sir, I think we found her." Naomi's hand moved to cover the patch, but it was too late. Dr. Cole saw it. Dr. Morrison saw it. The entire trauma team saw it. And the escort was already walking out of the room, radio pressed to his ear, speaking in tones too low to hear. Naomi tucked the chain back under her scrubs. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline draining away and leaving only the cold certainty that she'd just revealed something she'd spent 3 years hiding. The patient stabilized. His vitals evened out. The immediate crisis passed. Naomi stood there, exhausted, her leg barely holding her weight, knowing she'd saved his life and destroyed her own anonymity in the same moment. Then her knee gave out completely. No warning, no gradual weakness, just a sudden collapse as damaged cartilage and torn ligaments finally gave up under stress they were never meant to handle. She fell, catching herself on the crash cart, pain white-hot and consuming. Staff rushed to help her. She pushed them away. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Dr. Morrison said firmly. "You need to sit down. You need medical attention. I need you to not move him." Naomi's voice cut through the concern, sharp and focused despite the pain. She pointed at the patient. "Do not move him. Do not transfer him. He's stable now, but he'll crash again if you change his environment before addressing the underlying cavity pressure." "How do you know that?" Dr. Cole asked. "Because I've seen it kill people." Naomi's breath came hard through clenched teeth. "Please, just listen to me." They listened. They kept the patient exactly where he was. And 30 minutes later, when his vitals started declining again, they were ready. They caught it early. They treated it correctly. And he survived. Naomi sat in a chair in the hallway, ice on her knee, watching through windows as doctors saved a man using knowledge she'd given them. Knowledge she'd earned in places that haunted her sleep. Daniel Morrison, the hospital director, arrived with security in tow. His face was red with anger and corporate fear. "This is completely unacceptable. You're suspended. You violated direct orders. You endangered patients with your reckless—" "She saved that man's life." Dr. Morrison stepped between the director and Naomi. Twice, once from diagnosis, once from cardiac arrest, and she did it with knowledge that none of us possess. That doesn't excuse. I don't care about excuses. Dr. Morrison's voice was ice. I care about results. And the result is a living patient who would be dead without her. The director's face went purple. She's officially removed from all clinical duties pending investigation. Security will escort her from the premises. 2 security guards moved toward Naomi. She stood, slowly, painfully, leaning heavily on the chair. She met the director's eyes without fear. She'd faced worse than angry administrators. Then the sound started. Deep, distant, growing. A rhythmic thumping that made the windows vibrate and conversations stop. Everyone in the corridor turned toward the external walls, confused, as the sound built into something unmistakable. Helicopter rotors. Multiple helicopters. Big ones. Coming closer. The security guards stopped moving. The director's anger shifted to confusion. Naomi's face went completely white. She knew that sound. She knew what it meant when military helicopters came in formation. She knew what happened when operations went from classified to visible. The windows began to shake. The sound became deafening, and through the glass they could see them descending. 4 massive military helicopters, Marine insignia visible, moving with precise coordination toward the medical complex. Landing, right outside the hospital. "What is happening?" the director whispered. Naomi closed her eyes. "They're here for me." The entire hospital stopped functioning. Patients sat up in beds. Nurses abandoned their stations. Doctors pressed against windows. Security guards pulled out phones to record something they couldn't begin to understand. The sound of the helicopters was so loud it shook water in plastic cups, rattled equipment on carts, made the fluorescent lights flicker. 4 helicopters, Marine markings, descending with military precision onto the hospital's emergency vehicle area, the rotor wash sending debris and dust in swirling clouds. They touched down simultaneously, engines still running, doors already opening before the skids fully settled. Hospital security scrambled, confused and overwhelmed. Someone grabbed a radio, trying to contact local police, federal authorities, anyone who might explain why their parking lot had just become a military landing zone. The director stood frozen, his earlier anger replaced by fear and complete bewilderment. Dozens of Marines deployed from the helicopters, not running, not panicking, moving with practiced efficiency, weapons slung but ready, spreading out to establish a perimeter. They weren't aggressive. They weren't blocking exits or preventing people from moving, but they were absolutely, undeniably in control. Within 90 seconds, the hospital's entrance was surrounded by United States Marines in full combat gear. Medics in tactical vests carried specialized equipment. Officers spoke into radios with calm, measured tones, and through it all, the helicopters kept their engines running, ready for immediate departure. The director found his voice and his anger simultaneously. He pushed through the crowd of stunned staff and marched toward the entrance where a Marine officer stood coordinating the deployment. The director was short, overweight, and completely out of his depth. But bureaucratic indignation gave him false courage. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice cracked on the last word. "You can't just land military aircraft on hospital property without authorization. I'm calling the police. I'm calling federal authorities. This is completely—" "Sir." The Marine officer's voice cut through the director's panic like a blade through paper. "We have full authorization. This is a sanctioned military operation." "Operation? What operation?" "This is a civilian hospital. You have no jurisdiction here." The officer looked past the director, his eyes scanning the crowd of staff that had gathered. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, security guards, all staring, all recording on phones, all trying to understand what was happening to their normal Monday morning. "Sir, we're not here for your hospital." The officer's tone was respectful but immovable. "We're here for a specific individual." "What individual?" The officer's jaw tightened. "We're looking for someone who uses the call sign Shield 6. The name hit the crowd like a physical wave. Confusion rippled through the staff. People whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Shield 6. What was that? A person? A code? Some kind of military designation? No one had answers. No one understood. Except Naomi. She stood in the corridor inside, supported by an intern who'd helped her up after her knee had given out. The ice pack had fallen from her leg. Her hands gripped the intern's arm hard enough to hurt. Her face had gone from white to gray. Dr. Cole stood beside her. He looked at her face, looked at the Marines outside, looked back at her. Understanding dawned in his expression like sunrise after a long, dark night. "Shield 6, he whispered. "That's you." Naomi couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except watch as one Marine near the entrance turned, saw her through the glass, and went rigid. His eyes locked onto her face. Recognition hit him like lightning. He snapped into a salute so sharp and sudden it made other Marines turn to see what he was, saluting. Then they all saw her, and one by one, every Marine in sight came to attention and saluted. 40 trained soldiers, hardened combat veterans, standing in perfect military precision, all focused on a limping black nurse in worn scrubs who looked like she might collapse at any moment. The director's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, her surgical instincts telling her something massive was happening, even if she didn't understand what. The hospital staff pressed closer to windows, phones recording, confused whispers building into a roar of speculation. The commanding officer walked through the entrance, past security that didn't dare stop him, through the corridor that parted like water before him. He moved with purpose, but not aggression, his eyes fixed on Naomi with an expression that mixed relief, respect, and something close to reverence. He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to show respect. His voice, when it came, had no command tone, no military authority, just human emotion barely held in check. "Ma'am, we've been trying to find you for 3 years. Naomi's breath shook. "I didn't want to be found." "We know." The officer's voice was gentle. "But we need you." The director found his voice again, still not understanding, still angry because anger was easier than confusion. "Excuse me. This woman is a suspended nurse. She disobeyed hospital protocols. She has no authority here, and certainly, no." The officer turned to face the director. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Sir, this woman saved more Marines than any field surgeon in the last decade. She operated in conditions that would break most trained doctors. She kept men alive when command had written them off as casualties. She is a decorated combat medic with more confirmed saves than anyone in recent military history." The corridor went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye turned to Naomi, seeing her completely differently. Not the slow nurse, not the liability, not the woman who didn't fit, someone else entirely. Dr. Morrison spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "What happened to her?" The officer didn't look away from Naomi. She was embedded with a Marine reconnaissance unit that operated in regions where support was unreliable and extraction was often impossible. When things went wrong, when casualties were critical, when regular medics couldn't reach them, command had one standing order. He paused. "Send Shield 6. Naomi's eyes closed. Hearing the words spoken aloud, after 3 years of silence, felt like having old wounds reopened without anesthesia. She earned that call sign after saving 6 men in one night during a compound assault. Alone. under fire. No support, no backup. Just her and medical supplies that ran out after the third casualty. The officer's voice carried pride and pain in equal measure. After that, her unit trusted her above command, above air support, above everything, because they knew that as long as Shield 6 was breathing, none of them would die alone. Dr. Cole made a sound between a laugh and a sob. That's why you knew all those patterns. That's why you see things no one else sees. You've treated battlefield trauma more than most military surgeons. Naomi opened her eyes. I'm not that person anymore. You saved a man's life today using those skills, Dr. Morrison said quietly. That sounds like the same person to me. The officer gestured toward the helicopters outside, their rotors still spinning, ready for immediate action. Ma'am, one of our teams went down overseas, high-value operation, multiple critical casualties. We've got immediate extraction capability, but stabilization is the problem. The wounds are complex. The survival window is narrow, and every trauma specialist we've consulted has given us the same answer. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a sealed folder. They all said the same thing. If anyone can stabilize these casualties long enough for extraction, it's the combat medic who kept an entire recon unit alive for 72 hours in hostile territory with no reinforcement. He held out the folder. They all said we needed to find Shield 6. Naomi stared at the folder. Didn't take it. I can't do this anymore. I'm not that person. My knee is destroyed. I can't run. I can't carry. I can't function in the field. I'm broken. We're not asking you to carry anyone. The officer's voice was patient. We're asking you to do what you've always done, save lives when no one else can. I can't. Yes, you can. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. I've watched you work. I've seen what you do. And if you can save lives in this broken, underfunded hospital while suspended and injured, you can definitely save them with full military support. Naomi's hands were shaking. The folder hung between her and the officer like a bridge between two versions of herself. The person she'd been. The person she'd tried to become. The person everyone needed her to be. What's in the folder? She asked quietly. The officer's expression softened. Personnel files, medical briefs, injury reports, everything you'd need to assess the situation. He paused. And photographs. Photographs of what? The casualties waiting for you. His voice dropped. Your team, ma'am. What's left of them? Naomi's breath stopped. Her hand moved without conscious thought, taking the folder. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were medical reports, injury descriptions, tactical assessments, and photographs. Faces she recognized. Men she'd treated. Men she'd saved. Men who'd called her Shield 6 and meant it as prayer, and one face that made her legs nearly give out entirely. Captain Aaron Vale, her former unit leader. The man who'd recruited her. The man she'd watched fall. The man she'd believed dead for 3 years, listed as critical, listed as alive, listed as requiring immediate specialized intervention. The guilt she'd carried like stones in her chest cracked. Not disappeared, just cracked. Enough to let light through, enough to let her breathe. He's alive, she whispered. Barely. The officer's voice was gentle. He needs you. They all do. Naomi stared at the photographs, at the faces of people she'd failed and people she'd saved, and people who apparently never stopped needing her. Her knee throbbed. Her hands shook. Her entire body screamed at her to say no, to stay small, to stay hidden. But her heart, the part of her that had never stopped being Shield 6, no matter how hard she'd tried, was already making decisions her mind hadn't caught up to yet. She closed the folder, held it against her chest, looked at the officer with eyes that were filling with tears she'd held back for years. I need to see the patient first, the one we just stabilized. I need to make sure he's secure before I go anywhere. The officer nodded. "Will, wait." Naomi turned, limped back toward the trauma bay, the folder clutched in her hands, her entire world shifting beneath her feet. The Marines stepped aside. The staff parted, and through the windows, 4 massive helicopters waited with engines running, waiting for Shield 6 to remember who she was, waiting for her to save lives one more time, waiting for the invisible nurse to step back into legend. The hospital parking lot had transformed into something between a military staging area and a media spectacle. News helicopters circled at a distance, their cameras capturing footage that would be on every network within the hour. Hospital staff lined windows with phones raised. Patients who could walk had made their way to observation points. Everyone wanted to see what happened next. Inside the trauma bay, Naomi stood over the unidentified patient who was no longer unidentified to her. She'd opened his full medical file with Marine authorization. Captain Aaron Vale, 41 years old, 23 years of service. Her former commanding officer. The man who'd recruited a young medic with exceptional skills and turned her into something legendary. The man she'd believed she'd killed by following his orders. His vitals were stable now, but fragile, the kind of stable that could shatter with one wrong move. Naomi checked every line, every monitor, every medication drip with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly how fast stability could become crisis. Her hands moved across equipment with practiced precision, her mind cataloging risks and calculating probabilities. Dr. Cole stood beside her, watching quietly. He'd earned the right to witness this through his military background and his refusal to judge what he didn't understand. Dr. Morrison watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her surgeon's mind trying to process everything that had been revealed in the last hour. "He'll need monitoring every 15 minutes, Naomi said, her voice clinical, professional. "The cavity pressure is managed but not resolved. If his oxygen saturation drops below 94%, increase the ventilator pressure incrementally. If his blood pressure spikes above 140/90, it means the internal swelling is increasing, and you'll need to intervene surgically within the hour." Dr. Cole nodded, taking notes. "Anything else?" "Don't let anyone move him for at least 72 hours. His body has been through catastrophic trauma. Every system is compensating. Movement could trigger cascade failures." Naomi's eyes stayed on the monitors. "And don't let him wake up alone. When he comes out of sedation, he'll be disoriented. Combat veterans wake up fighting. Make sure someone's there to ground him." "I'll make sure of it." Dr. Morrison's voice carried absolute certainty. "He'll get the best care we can provide." Naomi finally looked up from the patient, looked at these 2 doctors who'd watched her transform from dismissed nurse to something else entirely. "Thank you for listening to me, even when you didn't understand why you should." "We should have listened sooner," Dr. Cole said quietly. "We should have seen who you were. You saw a limping nurse who slowed teams down." Naomi's voice held no bitterness, just fact. "That's what I wanted you to see. That's what I needed everyone to see." "Why?" Dr. Morrison asked. Naomi was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on Captain Vale's bedside rail. "Because being Shield 6 nearly destroyed me. I watched people die. I made choices about who lived and who didn't. I carried that weight until I couldn't stand up anymore." She gestured to her knee. "Literally couldn't stand, so I disappeared. I became someone small, someone ordinary. Someone who saved one life at a time instead of carrying the weight of dozens." "But you're still saving lives," Dr. Cole said. "You're still making impossible calls. You're still being Shield 6. You just tried to do it invisibly." "And it didn't work." Naomi's laugh was bitter and tired. "Because eventually the people who need saving show up anyway, and you either help them or watch them die. And I can't watch them die." The commanding officer appeared in the doorway. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reynolds, According to the insignia, Naomi could now read clearly. 45 years old, combat veteran, someone who understood exactly what he was asking her to do. "Ma'am, I don't mean to rush you, but our window is closing. The team overseas needs stabilization within the next 6 hours, or we start losing people." Naomi took a breath, let it out slowly, looked at Captain Vale one more time. Then she turned to face Reynolds fully. "Tell me exactly what happened, all of it. I need to know what I'm walking into." Reynolds gestured toward the hallway. They moved to a private consultation room, away from the crowds and cameras. Dr. Cole and Dr. Morrison followed without being invited. Reynolds didn't object. Some things needed witnesses. He spread a map across the table. Remote terrain. Mountainous. Hostile territory that officially didn't exist on any public record. Joint operation. Intelligence gathering. High-value target. The team went in quiet. 8 operators plus 2 support personnel. Mission was proceeding normally until they hit a secondary defensive position that wasn't in our intelligence. His finger traced a route on the map. IED took out their primary transport. Secondary explosion collapsed part of a structure. Team got trapped. 3 dead immediately, 5 critically wounded. 2 with moderate injuries trying to keep the others alive. Extraction? Naomi asked. Impossible for the first 48 hours. Enemy activity? Weather? Terrain? We got them out 3 days ago, but the casualties had already deteriorated past what field medics could manage. We've had them in a secure medical facility, but they're not stable enough for long-range transport to proper surgical centers. Reynolds pulled out photographs. Naomi forced herself to look. 5 men. 5 faces she recognized from years ago. Younger then, less scarred, less aware of how easily life could end. Sergeant Thomas Wright, 32, massive internal bleeding, partial liver laceration, spleen damage. He's had 3 surgeries but keeps destabilizing. Reynolds' voice was factual, but pain leaked through. Corporal David Bennett, 28, shrapnel through the lung, partial collapse, recurring pneumothorax. Every time they stabilize it, it recollapses within hours. He continued through the list. Compound fractures, crush injuries, internal trauma that civilian doctors treated like civilian accidents when they needed to be treated like battlefield damage. Different mechanisms, different complications, different survival strategies. And Captain Vale? Naomi's voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. Brain injury from the explosion, swelling, potential hemorrhage. He was unconscious when we extracted him. He woke up 48 hours ago, gave us coordinates for the rest of the team, then coded. We got him back, but he's been critical ever since. Reynolds met her eyes. He kept saying your name, Shield 6, over and over. That's how we knew to look for you. Naomi's hands flattened against the table. Why didn't you find me sooner? I've been here for 3 years. You disappeared completely, changed systems, changed records. Your military file was sealed and classified. We had no way to track you without proper authorization, and we had no reason to request authorization until this happened. Reynolds leaned forward. Ma'am, you have every right to refuse. No one can force you to do this. But these men need someone who understands battlefield trauma. Someone who's kept people alive in impossible situations. Someone they trust. They don't know me anymore. Naomi's voice cracked slightly. I'm not the person they remember. You're exactly the person they remember. Dr. Morrison spoke from the doorway. You're the person who saved a man's life today from a desk. You're the person who ran a code while suspended. You're the person who sees patterns no one else sees. That hasn't changed. Naomi looked at the photographs spread across the table. Men who'd trusted her. Men she'd saved. Men who'd become casualties again because war never really ended for soldiers. It just waited for opportunities to finish what it started. I need full medical histories. Every surgery they've had, every complication, every medication they're on. I need imaging, labs, everything. Her voice shifted. Not civilian nurse anymore. Not invisible anymore. Shield 6 making operational decisions. And I need to know exactly what resources you have available. Equipment, personnel, limitations. Reynolds pulled out a tablet and started listing resources. Full surgical capability, specialized equipment, experienced military medical staff. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. Someone who'd kept Marines alive when death was the only logical outcome. How's my mobility going to work? Naomi gestured to her knee. I can barely walk 20 feet without pain. I can't run. I can't carry. How am I supposed to function in the field? You're not going to the field. We're bringing them here. Reynolds' answer was immediate. We've got authorization to use this hospital as a staging area. We'll transport them here. Set up in a secured wing and you'll have everything you need. No running, no carrying, just medicine. Naomi absorbed that, nodded slowly, looked at Dr. Cole. I'm going to need help. Military trauma is different from civilian. I can lead procedures, but I need skilled hands who can adapt. I'm in, Dr. Cole said immediately. Whatever you need. Me too. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. You're not doing this alone. The hospital director isn't going to authorize this. Naomi's laugh was hollow. He was trying to fire me 30 minutes ago. The hospital director doesn't have a choice. Reynolds' voice carried quiet certainty. This is a federal operation now. We have authorization from levels that supersede hospital administration. He can cooperate, or he can be removed from the decision-making process. Naomi stood, her knee protesting, her back straight despite the pain. She looked at the photographs one more time. Men who'd bled for their country. Men who'd trusted her to keep them alive. Men who apparently still needed her. I want Captain Vale monitored every 10 minutes until I get back. I want full updates on any changes, and I want Dr. Cole running point on his care. She looked at Reynolds. When do they arrive? 6 hours. We'll have them wheels up in 90 minutes. They'll be here before sunset. Reynolds stood. Ma'am, I need to ask. Are you sure about this? Your injury, your current condition? I'm sure. Naomi's voice was iron. I let these men down once. I'm not doing it again. You never let them down, Reynolds said quietly. Captain Vale made sure we knew that. He said you saved his life by following his orders. He said you carried out a Marine under fire while taking shrapnel. He said you're the reason any of them survived that mission. Naomi's breath caught. 3 years of guilt. 3 years of believing she'd abandoned him. 3 years of carrying weight that apparently had never been hers to carry. The relief was physical, painful. Like setting down stones she'd held so long her hands had forgotten how to be empty. Thank you for telling me that, she whispered. Reynolds nodded. Welcome back, Shield 6. The hospital transformed over the next 6 hours. Marines secured an entire wing. Equipment arrived in trucks. Specialized medical supplies filled formerly empty rooms. Federal coordinators interfaced with hospital administration, while Daniel Morrison stood in the corner of his own office, watching his authority evaporate in the face of national security directives. Naomi spent those hours preparing. She reviewed every medical file, studied every injury, cross-referenced complications and treatments. Dr. Cole worked beside her, asking questions, taking notes, learning the differences between civilian and combat trauma. Dr. Morrison organized surgical teams and equipment, her administrative skills proving as valuable as her surgical ones. But while Naomi's mind worked through medical protocols, her memory kept pulling her backward, to the mission that had ended everything. The mission that had given her the limp and the guilt and the determination to disappear. She'd been 28 years old, already legendary, already carrying a reputation that made commanders request her specifically for operations where casualties were expected and extraction was uncertain. She'd saved dozens of lives, lost only 3. The math was impossibly good for the kind of work she did. Then came Operation Sandstone, joint operation, coalition forces. Intelligence suggested a high-value target in a compound complex in remote mountains. Naomi's unit had been assigned as support. Quick in, quick out. Routine by the standards of people who did impossible things routinely. Except the intelligence was wrong. The compound was more extensive than reported. The defensive positions were more sophisticated than expected. And when Naomi's unit breached the inner complex, they walked into an ambush that had been designed specifically to kill Marines. The explosion hit them like the fist of an angry god. The main charge destroyed their primary entry point. Secondary explosions collapsed sections of the compound. Fire, smoke, screaming. And Naomi, thrown 20 feet into a wall, struggling to stand on a leg that didn't work right anymore. She remembered pushing through the pain, finding her medical kit, starting triage while enemy fire still echoed. 6 men wounded, 3 critically. Captain Vale directing defense while blood poured from wounds he was ignoring. Naomi remembered operating in the dark, dust so thick she could barely see. Equipment damaged, supplies running out, making impossible choices about who got morphine and who had to endure agony. Keeping people alive through willpower and knowledge and sheer stubborn refusal to let them die. 48 hours. No reinforcement, no extraction. Radio communications spotty at best. Naomi operating on instinct and training, treating injuries that should have been death sentences, keeping Marines breathing through procedures that should have required surgical suites and not dirt floors and flashlight illumination. On the 3rd night, the enemy launched a final assault, trying to finish what the ambush had started. Captain Vale organized defense with 3 functioning operators and 2 who could barely hold weapons. The rest were too wounded, too damaged. Naomi kept them stable, kept them sedated, kept them from bleeding out while explosions shook the compound around them. Then came the blast that changed everything. A rocket-propelled grenade through a wall. Shrapnel everywhere. 2 men bleeding out simultaneously. Naomi triaging by flashlight, calculating who had more time, who needed intervention first. She chose the younger Marine. 22 years old, femoral artery compromised, seconds from bleeding out. She dove toward him, hands already moving, pressure applied, tourniquet deployed, life preserved. Behind her, Captain Vale screamed, not in pain, in command, ordering her to stay down, ordering her to cover the Marine, ordering her to let him handle his own wounds. Then the secondary explosion hit. The extraction route collapsed. The compound unstable. Captain Vale ordered immediate evacuation. Naomi argued. She could stabilize him. She could treat him. She just needed 5 minutes. That's an order, Shield 6. Get them out. She'd obeyed. Because that's what you did with direct orders. Because the structure was collapsing. Because the young Marine would die if she didn't move immediately. She'd carried him through smoke and fire, felt shrapnel tear through her knee as she shielded him from a 3rd explosion, kept moving on adrenaline and training and the absolute conviction that Marines didn't die if she could prevent it. She got him out. Got them all out except Captain Vale. The compound collapsed behind them. Fire consumed what was left. Rescue teams extracted them 30 minutes later. Naomi was still doing CPR on the Marine when the helicopters landed. He lived. 5 others lived. Captain Vale was declared dead in the collapse, and Naomi, decorated and destroyed, left the service the moment her leg could handle walking. She'd followed orders. She'd saved lives. And she'd abandoned her commanding officer to die alone in fire and rubble. Except he hadn't died. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived. And 3 years later, He was in a hospital bed 20 feet away from her, living proof that her guilt had been built on incomplete information. Dr. Cole found her in the empty hallway, sitting against a wall, her knee brace removed, her face wet with tears she'd finally allowed herself to shed. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I thought I killed him," Naomi whispered. "I thought following his orders meant leaving him to die. I carried that for 3 years, and it was wrong. All of it was wrong." Dr. Cole sat beside her. "Sounds like you were both trying to keep each other alive. Sounds like you succeeded. But at what cost?" Naomi gestured to her knee. "I'm broken. I can barely walk. I can't do half the things Shield 6 could do. What if I can't save them? What if they die because I'm not who I used to be?" "You saved Captain Vale today with a destroyed knee and a suspension." Dr. Cole's voice was gentle but firm. "You diagnosed combat trauma from 50 feet away. You ran a code while barely standing. You're not broken. You're just different. And different doesn't mean less capable." Naomi wiped her face. "I'm scared." "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. Means you care about getting it right." He stood, offered his hand. "Come on, your team's arriving in 90 minutes. Shield 6 wouldn't want to keep them waiting." She took his hand. Let him help her up, replaced her knee brace with practiced motions, and walked toward the secured wing where Marines were making final preparations. The helicopters arrived as the sun touched the horizon. Medical transports this time, not combat aircraft. They landed with the same precision as the morning flights, but the urgency was different. Lives hung in the balance of minutes, not hours. Naomi stood in the secured trauma wing, surrounded by equipment and personnel. Dr. Cole on her right, Dr. Morrison on her left. Marine medical staff positioned at each station, everything ready, everything prepared, everything waiting for casualties that would determine if Shield 6 was legend or memory. The first gurney came, through. Sergeant Thomas Wright. The internal bleeding case. His vitals were bad. Not critical yet, but sliding toward the edge. Naomi moved to his side, her hands already assessing, her mind already calculating. She gave rapid instructions, adjusted medications, repositioned equipment, stabilized him within 8 minutes. The second gurney. Corporal David Bennett. The recurring pneumothorax. Naomi saw the problem immediately. The chest tube placement was wrong. Functional, but wrong. She repositioned it personally, ignoring the pain in her knee, her hands moving with muscle memory that had never forgotten how to save lives. 3 more casualties arrived in succession, each one critical, each one requiring immediate intervention. Naomi moved between them like a conductor leading an orchestra. Her voice never rose, her hands never shook. She gave orders that were followed instantly, because everyone in that room understood they were watching someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. 2 hours passed. Every casualty stabilized, every immediate crisis managed. The trauma wing settled into careful monitoring and cautious optimism. Marines who'd expected to start losing people watched in stunned silence as Shield 6 pulled off what military doctors had said was impossible. She'd stabilized them all, every single one. The legend was real, but the cost was visible. Naomi's knee had given out twice. She'd worked the second hour leaning heavily on equipment. Her face was gray with pain. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. She'd saved them all, but she'd broken herself doing it. Dr. Morrison gently took her arm. "You need to rest. Your leg can't take much more. I need to check on them one more time." Naomi's voice was slurred with exhaustion. "Make sure they're stable. Make sure nothing's changing. They're stable because of you. Now let someone take care of you." Dr. Morrison's tone left no room for argument. She guided Naomi to a chair, elevated her leg, applied ice, called for pain medication. Naomi sat in that chair, watching monitors from across the room. her mind still calculating risks and running through complications even as her body shut down. Dr. Cole brought her water. Marine medics thanked her with voices thick with emotion. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds stood in the doorway with an expression that mixed respect and concern. "You did it," he said quietly. "They said it couldn't be done. You did it anyway. They're not out of danger yet." Naomi's eyes never left the monitors. "Stabilization isn't healing. They need ongoing care. They need you to rest." Reynolds moved closer. "You've given them a chance they didn't have 6 hours ago. That's enough for tonight." Naomi wanted to argue, wanted to stay vigilant, wanted to be the person who never stopped watching over her team. But her body had other ideas. Exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. The adrenaline drained away. And for the first time, in 3 years, surrounded by people she'd saved, and people who understood what saving them meant, Naomi Carter closed her eyes and let herself rest. She dreamed of helicopters, but this time, when they landed, no one was left behind. The call came at 3 in the morning. Naomi had been asleep for barely 4 hours, her leg elevated, pain medication wearing off, when her phone vibrated with an urgency that meant someone was dying. She answered before the second ring, her mind already shifting from exhausted rest to complete focus. "Captain Vale is crashing." Dr. Cole's voice was steady but tight. "Brain pressure spiking. We need you now." Naomi was moving before he finished speaking. Pain shot through her knee the moment weight hit it. She ignored the sensation, strapped on her brace with practiced speed, and limped toward the secured wing faster than her body wanted to allow. The hospital corridors were quiet at this hour, emergency lighting casting everything in shades of blue and shadow. She arrived to controlled chaos. Vale's monitor showed intracranial pressure climbing into dangerous territory. His sedation had been increased but wasn't holding. His body was fighting itself, swelling, threatening to cause irreversible brain damage. The military medical team had implemented standard protocols, but standard wasn't working. Dr. Morrison stood at the bedside, her hands steady but her expression showing concern. "We've tried everything in the civilian playbook. Nothing's bringing the pressure down. If we can't get it under control in the next 30 minutes, we're looking at emergency surgery." Naomi moved to the monitors, her eyes scanning readings with the speed of someone who'd learned to process information while explosions happened around her. The pattern was wrong. Not civilian wrong, combat wrong. The kind of wrong that came from blast injuries and the specific ways explosive force damaged brain tissue differently than blunt trauma. "It's not just swelling," she said quietly. "It's reactive inflammation from the blast mechanism. His body's treating the injury like there's still foreign material present. Standard anti-inflammatory protocols won't touch it because they're designed for different injury types." "What do we do?" Dr. Cole asked. Naomi's mind raced through options. Procedures she'd performed in field hospitals, techniques taught by military neurosurgeons who specialized in blast injuries, approaches that civilian medicine hadn't caught up to yet because civilian medicine didn't deal with people who survived explosions at close range. "We need to do a hybrid protocol, combine hyperosmolar therapy with targeted cooling and a specific steroid sequence that's used for blast-related brain injuries. It's aggressive. It's technically off-label for this scenario, and it works." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "I've seen it save lives when everything else failed." Dr. Morrison looked at Dr. Cole. Dr. Cole looked at the monitors showing Captain Vale sliding closer to irreversible damage. Then they both looked at Naomi. "Tell us what you need," Dr. Morrison said. The next hour was surgical precision without surgery. Naomi directed every intervention, her voice calm, her instructions specific. Medication combinations that seemed counterintuitive until you understood blast injury mechanics. Cooling procedures that had to be timed exactly right. Monitoring that required understanding the relationship between intracranial pressure and systemic response in ways that textbooks didn't cover. Dr. Cole followed her instructions without question, his military medical background helping him understand the logic even when it contradicted civilian training. Dr. Morrison adapted quickly, her surgical experience making her hands steady and reliable. Marine medics assisted with equipment they'd used in field hospitals overseas. 30 minutes in, Vale's pressure started dropping, slowly, incrementally. The numbers, moving in the right direction for the first time in hours. Naomi watched the monitors like they were telling a story only she could fully read, making tiny adjustments, fine-tuning the approach, guiding Vale back from the edge. 60 minutes in, his pressure stabilized. Not normal yet, but controlled, sustainable, out of immediate danger. The trauma team exhaled collectively. Dr. Morrison stepped back from the bedside, her shoulders dropping with relief. "How did you know that would work?" she asked. "I've done it before, multiple times." Naomi's hands were shaking now that the emergency had passed. Field hospitals overseas. We saw a lot of blast injuries, lost a lot of people before we figured out how to treat them differently. This protocol was developed by necessity and a neurosurgeon who refused to accept that explosion survivors were untreatable. Dr. Cole brought her a chair. She sat before her leg could make the decision for her. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving only exhaustion and pain that medicine could barely touch anymore. "You should rest," Dr. Morrison said gently. "I need to stay, in case he crashes again. We'll monitor him. We know what to do now." Dr. Morrison's hand rested on Naomi's shoulder. "You've done enough. You've done more than enough." But Naomi couldn't leave. Something kept her rooted in that chair, watching Captain Vale breathe, watching monitors that showed life continuing when it could have stopped. She'd spent 3 years believing she'd failed him. 3 years carrying guilt that had nearly destroyed her. And now he was alive in front of her, breathing because of decisions she'd made both years ago and tonight. The weight of it was overwhelming. The relief, the exhaustion, the realization that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't failed the way she'd believed. That following orders and saving lives weren't mutually exclusive. That sometimes survival looked like difficult choices made in impossible moments. Captain Vale's eyes opened at dawn. Not fully conscious yet, but aware enough to focus on faces. Naomi was still in the chair beside his bed, her knee elevated, ice pack replaced multiple times through the night. Dr. Cole had stayed with her, keeping watch, making sure she didn't try to stand on a leg that had nothing left to give. Vale's gaze found Naomi. Recognition flickered through confusion. His lips moved, forming words that vocal cords damaged by intubation couldn't quite produce. But Naomi understood. She'd always understood what her team needed before they could ask. "You're safe," she said quietly. "You're at St. Benedict's hospital. You've been here 3 days. Your team is here too. They're stable. Everyone's stable." Vale's eyes filled with tears. He tried to move his hand toward her. The effort was enormous for someone who'd been fighting for his life. Naomi caught his hand gently, her fingers wrapping around his. "Shield 6, he whispered, the words barely audible. "You came." "Of course, I came." Naomi's voice cracked. "You called. I answered. That's what we do. I'm sorry." The words cost him visible effort. "The mission. Your knee. I should have. You saved my life by ordering me to evacuate." Naomi leaned forward, making sure he could see her clearly. "You saved everyone by making the hard call. I spent 3 years thinking I abandoned you. But you survived because you gave me an order I could follow. You survived because you're too stubborn to die." Vale's laugh was weak, barely a breath, but real. "Takes one to know one. Rest now," Naomi said. "Your team needs you healthy. I need you healthy. So rest." His eyes closed, his breathing evened, and Naomi sat back in her chair, still holding his hand, feeling like something that had been broken for 3 years was finally beginning to heal. Over the next 48 hours, miracles became routine. Sergeant Wright's internal bleeding stopped completely. Corporal Bennett's lungs stabilized without recurring collapse. The other casualties showed improvement that military doctors had said was unlikely at best. Shield 6's reputation wasn't just legend, it was reproducible, observable, documented fact. But there was a cost. Naomi's knee was destroyed beyond what pain medication could manage. She'd worked 3 consecutive days on a joint that needed surgery and months of rehabilitation. Dr. Morrison finally insisted on imaging. The results showed damage that made the orthopedic specialist wince. "You need complete reconstruction," he said, showing her the scans. "The joint is essentially non-functional. You're walking on willpower and damaged cartilage. Every step is causing more destruction." "How long until I can get the surgery?" Naomi asked. "You should have had it yesterday. You should have had it 3 years ago." The specialist's voice was gentle but firm. "You've been operating on a knee that most people couldn't walk on. It's remarkable that you've functioned at all. Can you fix it?" "I can try. But there's significant damage. You'll need months of recovery, and you may never walk without pain again." He paused. "I'm sorry. I wish I had better news." Naomi nodded slowly. She'd known this was coming. Had known for 3 years that she was borrowing time from a future that would eventually demand payment. "Schedule it after my team is stable enough to transfer to proper military medical facilities. That could be weeks. Then it'll be weeks." Her voice left no room for argument. "I'm not leaving them before they're ready." Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds found her that afternoon, sitting in the secured wing's observation room, watching her stabilized Marines through glass. He sat beside her without asking permission. "The Pentagon wants to give you a medal," he said. "Multiple medals, actually. Recognition for this operation. Retroactive recognition for previous service. They want to hold a ceremony. Make this public. Show the world what Shield 6 can do." Naomi was quiet for a long moment. "I don't want medals. I don't want ceremonies. I don't want to be public." "I figured you'd say that." Reynolds pulled out a different folder. "Alternative proposal. The military wants to establish a new trauma training program, teach civilian doctors how to handle combat injuries, prepare hospitals for mass casualty events, bridge the gap between battlefield medicine and civilian care. They want you to lead it." "I can't lead anything. I can barely walk." "You don't need to walk to teach. You don't need to be in the field to train the next generation." Reynolds opened the folder. "It would be based here. St. Benedict's would become a hybrid military-civilian trauma center. You'd train doctors, develop protocols, save lives by making other people better at saving lives." Naomi looked at the proposal, looked at her Marines through the glass, looked at her ruined knee that had carried her through impossible situations and was finally giving up. "Can I think about it?" "Take all the time you need." Reynolds stood. "But for what it's worth, those men in there wouldn't be alive without you. And there are hundreds more who need what you know. Maybe saving one life at a time isn't enough anymore. Maybe it's time to save thousands by teaching others how." The hospital board meeting happened 3 weeks after the Marines arrived. Daniel Morrison sat at the head of the table, his authority restored, but his attitude significantly adjusted. Dr. Morrison presented data. Dr. Cole provided testimony. And Naomi sat in the corner, her leg in a post-surgical brace, finally fixed properly after years of damage. The proposal was straightforward. St. Benedict's would become the first civilian hospital with an integrated military trauma program. Federal funding would address budget shortfalls. Training would elevate the entire medical staff. And Naomi Carter would lead the development of protocols that could save lives in both military and civilian contexts. The vote was unanimous. Even the board members who'd never heard Naomi's name before the helicopters landed understood what she represented. Not just one exceptional medic, but the possibility of making every trauma team exceptional. Captain Vale woke fully 2 days later. His brain pressure had normalized. His cognitive function was intact. He could speak clearly, move purposefully, and remember everything about the mission that had nearly killed him. When Naomi visited his room, he was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he'd looked in weeks. "They tell me you saved my life." Again. His voice was rough but steady. "They tell me you ordered me to save it the first time." Naomi settled into the chair beside his bed. "So technically, you saved your own life by making good command decisions. Is that what we're calling it?" Vale's smile was tired but genuine. "I remember thinking I was dying. I remember telling you to get the team out. I remember being at peace with it, because I knew you'd make sure they survived. I thought you died. I spent 3 years believing I'd abandoned you. You followed orders, you saved lives. That's not abandonment, that's being a Marine." Vale reached for her hand. "I survived because coalition forces found me. Because you'd stabilized me enough that I lasted until rescue arrived. Everything you did in those 72 hours kept me alive through the collapse and the fire and the days after. You didn't abandon me. You gave me a chance." Naomi's eyes filled. "I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you didn't let guilt destroy you. Though I hear you tried pretty hard." Vale squeezed her hand. "What's next for Shield 6? Shield 6 is retiring. Permanently." Naomi gestured to her leg. "This knee is fixed, but it's not military ready. I can walk, I can function, but I can't run through fire carrying people anymore." "Good. You did that enough for 3 lifetimes." Vale leaned back against his pillows. "So what's next for Naomi Carter?" She told him about the training program, about teaching doctors to recognize combat trauma patterns, about building systems that would save lives by making hospitals better prepared, about staying in one place instead of disappearing into anonymity. Vale listened carefully, then smiled. "Sounds like you're still being Shield 6, just with a bigger team." "Maybe." Naomi considered that. "Or maybe I'm finally learning that protecting people doesn't always look like carrying them through explosions. Sometimes it looks like teaching others to do what I did. I think you'll be good at it." Vale's eyes were starting to close, exhaustion pulling him back toward healing sleep. "You were always good at making impossible things possible. This is just a different kind of impossible." Over the following months, St. Benedict's transformed. The trauma wing expanded. Equipment was upgraded. Protocols were rewritten. And Naomi Carter, walking with a slight limp that would never fully disappear, taught doctors and nurses how to see trauma through battlefield eyes. She taught them about blast patterns and shrapnel distribution, about how combat injuries progress differently than civilian accidents, about making decisions in seconds that determined who lived and who died. She taught them not just medicine, but the mindset that had made Shield 6 legendary. Dr. Cole became her primary collaborator, his military background making him the perfect bridge between her knowledge and civilian application. Dr. Morrison ran the administrative side, ensuring protocols were implemented and funding continued flowing. Together, they built something unprecedented. Young nurses who'd never heard of Shield 6 learned from her directly. Trauma residents who'd dismissed her as slow and incompetent now fought for spots in her training rotations. The orderlies who'd whispered about her being unfit watched her teach procedures that saved lives they'd thought were unsavable. Sarah Mitchell, the senior nurse who'd complained about Naomi's speed, approached her 6 months into the program. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I judged you without understanding. I'm sorry." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. "We all make judgments based on what we can see. You saw someone who limped and assumed incompetence. That's human. What matters is what you do when you learn you were wrong. I'd like to join your training program, if you'll have me. Everyone's welcome who wants to learn. Naomi's smile was genuine. That includes people who doubted me. Doubt keeps us honest, as long as it doesn't keep us from trying. The Marines transferred to proper military medical facilities once they were stable enough for transport. Each one thanked Naomi personally before leaving. Sergeant Wright, walking with assistants, promised to name his first daughter after her. Corporal Benedict, breathing without mechanical support, saluted her with tears in his eyes. The others, each carrying their own gratitude, left pieces of themselves with the woman who'd refused to let them die. Captain Vale was the last to transfer. His recovery had been slowest, but most complete. By the time he left St. Benedict's, he was walking unassisted, thinking clearly, and already planning his return to active duty. "You know they're going to ask you to come back," he said during his final visit to Naomi's office. "Once word spreads about what you did here, every military command is going to want Shield 6 for their operations." "Shield 6 doesn't exist anymore," Naomi said firmly. "I'm a trainer now, a teacher. That's where I'm needed." "Fair enough." Vale stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think this is where you were always meant to be. You were amazing in the field. But teaching others to save lives, that's going to save more people than you ever could have reached alone." After he left, Naomi sat in her office, looking at photographs on her wall. Not the hidden photos from her locked box at home. New photos. Her training class. Her surgical team. Marines who'd survived because she'd remembered how to be Shield 6 when they needed her. And one photo from the day the helicopters had landed. Naomi standing in her scrubs, surrounded by saluting Marines, looking overwhelmed and exhausted, and exactly like someone who'd just been reminded of who they really were. She'd tried to be invisible, tried to be small, tried to save one life at a time as penance for the ones she believed she'd failed. But invisibility hadn't worked, because people who could save lives the way she could save them couldn't stay hidden. The world kept finding them, kept needing them, kept demanding they be more than they wanted to be. So Naomi had stopped hiding, stopped shrinking, stopped pretending her past didn't matter. She'd taken everything that Shield 6 had been and transformed it into something sustainable, something that didn't require her to carry people through fire because she was teaching others how to fight the flames. A young nurse knocked on her office door. "Dr. Carter, we have a trauma case coming in. Multi-vehicle accident, multiple casualties. The attending wants you in the bay." Naomi stood, her knee protesting slightly, the permanent reminder of who she'd been and what she'd sacrificed. "I'll be right there." She walked through the hospital corridors, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. Staff nodded as she passed. Interns made way respectfully. Patients in hallway beds watched her with recognition. She entered the trauma bay where organized chaos was already unfolding. Dr. Cole saw her and relaxed slightly. Dr. Morrison was directing triage. The team moved with efficiency that hadn't existed before Shield 6 came home. Naomi assessed the casualties with trained eyes, saw patterns, calculated priorities, gave quiet instructions that were followed immediately. Not because she pulled rank or demanded obedience, but because everyone in that room knew she saw things they couldn't see yet. The trauma stabilized. Lives were saved. The team worked together like a machine, each person knowing their role, understanding the larger picture. And Naomi stepped back, letting them finish, watching what she'd taught them become action. This was her mission now. Not carrying soldiers through fire, not making impossible choices in impossible moments, but making every moment less impossible for every person who came after her. As she left the trauma bay, a Marine in dress uniform stood in the hallway. He was young, maybe 25. his chest showing ribbons that meant he'd seen combat and survived it. He saluted when he saw her. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. Corporal Davis. You trained the medic who saved my life overseas. He said you taught him everything he knows. He said you're the reason he could keep me alive until extraction arrived." Naomi returned his salute, the gesture feeling right in a way it hadn't for 3 years. "Your medic saved your life. I just gave him tools. He said you'd say that. He also said to tell you that Shield 6 isn't just one person anymore. It's everyone you teach, everyone who learns to save lives the way you saved lives." The Marine smiled. "He said you've made an army of angels." After he left, Naomi stood in the hallway, absorbing those words. An army of angels. Hundreds of medical professionals learning to see combat trauma. Thousands of lives that would be saved by people she'd trained. A legacy that didn't require her to destroy her body because she'd already given everything that mattered, her knowledge. She walked toward the windows overlooking the parking lot where helicopters had landed months ago. The lot was empty now, normal, but the memory remained, written into the hospital's history and her own story. They'd called her Shield 6 because she protected Marines from death itself. But maybe protection looked different now. Maybe it looked like knowledge shared. Maybe it looked like protocols written. Maybe it looked like a limping woman teaching others to run toward danger instead of away from it. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the hospital complex. Naomi watched the light fade and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, purpose, and the certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. They'd told the limping black nurse to stay back, and when 4 Marine helicopters demanded Shield 6, they'd learned she'd been there all along, working, saving lives, refusing to let people die even when her own body was breaking. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a teacher, a trainer, a bridge between military and civilian medicine. And every life saved by someone she'd taught was proof that Shield 6 hadn't retired. She'd just learned to multiply herself by sharing everything she knew with everyone willing to learn. That wasn't just being an angel. That was being more than any legend could contain. If the people who saved your life when no one else could suddenly disappeared into silence, would you even know what the world had lost? Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us heroes don't always look the way we expect them to.